The Turkish Grand Prix of 2020 really did have it all. Record-breaking victories and a 7th world title for Lewis Hamilton, spins, twists, and also an eventful qualifying led to one of the best races of 2020. But of course, there is always a little bit more to the story than just the final results. So today we are taking a look at the Turkish Grand Prix of 2020, a tale in the data. Now, if you are at all new to this series that I'm running on my channel, where races are suggested by people in the comments down below, I'll be taking an in-depth look at not only the starting grid, but also each particular phase of the Grand Prix, looking at the lap times set by each driver, lap time graphs, charts, positional charts as well, and seeing exactly where each driver in each particular phase was gaining time and losing time, and then determining what exactly made it a good Grand Prix. The first tale in the data, I looked at the 2014 Bahrain Grand Prix. That will be left in a card in the corner. But we start our journey for the 2020 Turkish Grand Prix with the starting grid and a very shaken up qualifying. On the front row, we had Lance Stroll, the first pole for a Canadian for a very, very long time, and also Racing Point's first pole position. Then just 3/10 behind that was Max Verstappen, the favourite for pole position this session. Both drivers also starting on the used wet compound of tyre. Then starting on the second row are the teammates, Sergio Perez and Alex Albon, 1.5 seconds down for Perez and 2.6 seconds down for Albon, with Albon actually starting on new wet compounds of tyre. Row number 3 is headed by Daniel Ricciardo in P5, 3.8 seconds down, also on the used wet compound. And then P6 is the reigning champion Lewis Hamilton, 4.8 seconds down, also starting on the new wet compound of tyre like Alex Albon ahead. Then row number 4 is Esteban Ocon, 4.8 seconds down, and then P8 is Kimi Raikkonen, 4.9 seconds down. And then finally for Q3 and completing row number 5, we have Valtteri Bottas, 5.5 seconds down, starting also on the new wet compound of tyre, and then P10 is Antonio Giovinazzi, 9.5 seconds down. So within the top 10 and in the Q3 session, we have 3 drivers starting on the new wet compound of tyre: Lewis Hamilton, Alex Albon, and Valtteri Bottas. The remaining 7 drivers are all on the used wet compound of tyre. There is an absolutely enormous spread between these 10 drivers of 9.5 seconds. That mainly comes from the conditions at hand and the brand new track surface that was laid for the Turkish Grand Prix. However, taking a look now at the second half of the starting grid, we have row number 6 and the Q2 runners of Lando Norris and Sebastian Vettel. Just 2/10 down for Sebastian Vettel on Lando Norris, both drivers on the used wet tyres. Then again, like the front 2 rows, we have the teammates next, with Carlos Sainz in P13 and Charles Leclerc in P14. Half a second down for Sainz and 1.7 seconds down for Leclerc. And then row number 7 is Pierre Gasly, who was 3.6 seconds down on Lando Norris's Q2 time, and then the first out in Q1 was Kevin Magnussen. All 6 of these drivers are starting on the used wet tyres. And then delving into the drivers that were knocked out in Q1 behind Kevin Magnussen, we have Danny Kvyat and George Russell, with George Russell starting on the new intermediate compound of tyres. So far the first driver to start on the Inters. He was 2 seconds down on Magnussen's time. And then completing the grid, we've got Romain Grosjean and Nicholas Latifi. Grosjean being 4.9 seconds down on Magnussen's time on the used wet compound of tyre, and then Nicholas Latifi being 13.6 seconds down. Like his teammate George Russell, he too is starting on the new intermediate tyres. So there is the qualifying grid all laid out from Saturday. We have a very mixed up grid. We have an unusual pole sitter. We have the 2 Mercedes who were so dominant in qualifying this year, starting in P6 and P9. We have slightly different varying compounds of tyres. We've got the 2 Williams on the new intermediates. We have several drivers on the new wet compound of tyres and the remaining on the used wets. And now let's just recap exactly what happened in the Grand Prix. Taking a look at the results, it was Lewis Hamilton who came from P6 on the grid to claim a victory by over 30 seconds, and with it, his 7th world title. Sergio Perez claims a podium for Racing Point in P2, and then Sebastian Vettel gets his first podium of the year in P3, followed by Charles Leclerc after a last lap battle. Then Carlos Sainz is P5, followed by the 2 Red Bulls who started P2 and P4. Then we've got Lando Norris in P8, Lance Stroll, the pole sitter, down in P9, 72 seconds off of the pace of Hamilton. And then we have Ricciardo in P10, completing the points. However, there is so much more to this story than just the final results. A lot happened in this Grand Prix, and if we take a look at the lap time charts, we can divide it up into each individual phase. So on screen now we can see the Turkish Grand Prix lap chart, and for the first 15 or so laps is where we begin with phase number 1. These lap times were always slower than a 1 minute 50, somewhere above the 2 minute range. This is when most people were on the wet compound of tyre and coming in for their first set of pit stops. We then have a small VSC period from lap number 12 to lap number 15, where after that and until the second round of pit stops, we have phase number 2, taking up a significant chunk of this Grand Prix. And then finally, from the end of phase 2 to the end of the checkered flag, we have phase number 3. So with the phases of today's Grand Prix all laid out, let us take a deeper look at each one and break down exactly where each driver was faster and each driver was slower. And so we begin with phase number 1 of the Turkish Grand Prix of 2020, laps number 1 through to 13. And we begin by taking a look at the lap time chart. This details each driver's lap time in seconds on every single lap of the Grand Prix. We are only looking at the top 10 drivers so far, the 2 Mercedes, the 2 Red Bulls, the 2 McLarens, the 2 Racing Points and the 2 Renaults. The next remaining drivers will come on the second slide. And now averaging out this phase, I am aware it does cross over 2 sets of tyre compounds, but we'll be breaking down the wet weather runners in a little moment's time. We can see that it was actually Sergio Perez who set the fastest average lap time in this period. This average is excluding the pit stops. Everyone took at least 1 pit stop during this phase, and also the starting lap. And the 2 drivers that were closest to his average lap time over these 13 laps was his teammate, who was exactly 1/10 behind, and also Max Verstappen, who was 8 thousandths behind his teammate Lance Stroll. The next 2 drivers who come closest to this average are Alex Albon, who is just under 4/10 behind the average, and Lewis Hamilton, who is just over 4/10 behind this average. We then get Valtteri Bottas and also Carlos Sainz, who are 8/10 behind the average, and then we have a few drivers who are above a second. We have Daniel Ricciardo and Lando Norris, who are 8/10 apart, and then we have Esteban Ocon here on the end, who is 2.1 seconds down. But bear in mind, I have already excluded his slow laps, so lap number 13 on the intermediate tyres, his 2 pit stops, and also the starting lap. And turning our attention to the fastest lap time set on the wet compound of tyre, that was Max Verstappen on lap number 10, 108.6 seconds. But then conversely, the fastest lap time that was set just after the first round of pit stops on the intermediate compound of tyre came from Lewis Hamilton on a used set, which he took all the way to the end on lap number 10, a 105.872. And so with the first 10 drivers all complete, we will now take a look at the second set of drivers. These are the 2 Ferraris, the 2 Alfa Tauris, the 2 Alfa Romeos, the 2 Haas cars, and finally the 2 Williams cars. And then averaging out the first 13 laps, once again excluding pit stops and the opening laps, we can see that Sebastian Vettel was almost 4/10 down on the average set by Sergio Perez. This time was 1/100th quicker than Alex Albon and about 0.5 faster than Lewis Hamilton. Then his teammate Charles Leclerc was the next fastest, just over 0.5 seconds down, followed by George Russell on his new intermediate tyres. He was just 0.7 down. Whereas comparing this to his teammate Nicholas Latifi just to the right, he was 4.1 seconds down. Latifi really didn't enjoy the rain whatsoever. And then the fastest wet time that was set for these 10 drivers was here on lap number 10 by Pierre Gasly, a 112.699. And then conversely, the fastest intermediate lap time was also set by Pierre Gasly straight after his pit stop, a 107.230, over 5 seconds faster than his wet tyre pace. So that's all well and good just looking at the actual numbers and comparing them side by side, but what does this look visually? So on screen now is the phase 1 lap chart in the top left, the phase 1 position chart in the bottom left, and then a table of the average wet tyre pace, which actually has the Red Bulls significantly faster than any other car on the grid. This is averaged across all of the wet tyre laps for each driver, again excluding the opening lap. But turning our attention to the lap chart in the top left, just by these two red arrows we can see a significant gap between the first half of the field and the second. This gap lasts for about 7 or 8 laps, averaging at around a second or 2 seconds per lap, providing a very, very wide field of play between the first half of the field and the second. Then here on lap number 10 is where Lewis Hamilton sets his fastest lap of phase number 1 on his used intermediate compound of tyres just after his pit stop. And other than that, there really isn't too much to point out on the lap chart. So turning our attention to the positions chart, we can see the pit stop for Charles Leclerc just here, and then also Valtteri Bottas a couple of laps after, as well as a string here by this red arrow of 3 drivers. As well as a few laps later down at the bottom, we have the pit stops for the first few drivers as well, causing this nice looking pattern from laps 10 to laps 13. And then with phase 1 all looked at, we now delve on in to phase number 2, the largest phase of this Grand Prix, laps 15 to laps 40. And again, taking a look at the lap time charts, which are a little bit longer, everybody is on the intermediate tyres, either the brand new set or a used set of intermediates. And once again, averaging out the lap times across this period, again excluding any of the pit stops / slow laps as well, we can see that neither of these drivers in the top 10 actually has the fastest average lap time. The driver to come closest to the average lap time is actually Lewis Hamilton, who was half a second down on whoever set the pace, who we will take a look at in a little bit. With Lando Norris just here on lap number 38, setting the first sub 100 second lap time. But taking a look at consistency, which is always a main point when it comes to wet weather racing, we can see a large portion of laps here from 26 down to the end of phase 2 at lap 40, a very, very good consistency from Lewis Hamilton, a spread of about 1.5 seconds. And comparing this to a spread of 1.5 seconds for Valtteri Bottas, the period is only between laps 31 and 32. But now taking a look at the second half of the grid and seeing who actually set the pace, it was Charles Leclerc, a 103.185 average across these laps. And then the next closest person to him was actually his teammate, who was 9 tenths down. Leclerc was absolutely rapid in this phase of the Grand Prix. And then just to point out Kevin Magnussen's super slow pit stop, this is just over 3 minutes. But now taking a look at what this looks like visually, we can see the phase 2 lap time chart in the top left and the phase 2 positional chart in the bottom left. And then pulling up the positions and the gaps on where we left off at the start of phase number 2, we have Lance Stroll leading Sergio Perez by 9 seconds, who has Max Verstappen oh so very close, just half a second back. Then Sebastian Vettel is running P4 in between Alex Albon. Lewis Hamilton is down there as well, just ahead of Daniel Ricciardo and also Carlos Sainz. And then taking a look at where we left off at the end of phase number 2, we've got Lewis Hamilton, who has clawed all the way up to the top, 8 seconds ahead of Sergio Perez. But it's this phase 2 lap time chart that we can draw a touch more data from than just the phase 1 chart. By this red arrow here, we can see that Charles Leclerc and also Alex Albon are going significantly faster than the rest of the field for about 5 or 6 laps, and this gap is around 0.8 to 1.2 seconds per lap. Then in the middle portion of phase number 2, around lap 27 through to 29 by these 2 red arrows here, we can see again a small division between the field, where it splits off into the front half and then also the rear half. We then have Charles Leclerc here post pit stop, once again setting in quick lap times sub 101 seconds. And then over by lap 38 just here, we've got Lando Norris's fast lap, the first one sub 100 seconds, and in between Charles Leclerc's fast laps and Lando Norris's fastest lap, we have Carlos Sainz, who pops in a decent lap as well. And then just looking at the positional charts, as everybody else is coming in for their pit stops, changing on to a new set of intermediate tyres, we can see that Lewis Hamilton just doesn't. And this is where he gains the most time. He doesn't come in for a second pit stop. He doesn't necessarily go the fastest in this Grand Prix, he just doesn't make that extra stop. And so from phase 2, we take a look now at the final phase, phase number 3. Laps 41 to 58. And again, we start by looking at the individual lap times of each driver, and then averaging out each of these times again, it isn't Lewis Hamilton that is the fastest. Like I said in the previous section, he was not necessarily the fastest car on the track, he just did one less pit stop than everybody else. The fastest average time goes to Lando Norris, almost sub 100 seconds. With the next closest person to him being his teammate Carlos Sainz being 3/10 down, and then also Lewis Hamilton, who was just 4/10 down. So Hamilton was definitely quick, but he wasn't the quickest. We then also have the longest run of sub 100 second lap times also set by Lando Norris from laps 51 through to lap 58, where he set the fastest lap time of the Grand Prix of a 96.806. And then taking a look at the second half of the drivers, we can see that it's actually Sebastian Vettel who comes closest, just over half a second down on Lando Norris's average. This is a touch slower than Lewis Hamilton's pace, but a lot faster than everybody else. We've then got Charles Leclerc who goes 7/10 slower than Lando Norris's pace, with the remaining drivers in this sheet either being above a second in the case of Pierre Gasly 1.1, or in the case of Grosjean, 6.9 seconds down on the pace set by Lando Norris. And the first sub 100 second lap time in this section comes from Charles Leclerc of a 99.961. However, it is his teammate Sebastian Vettel who goes on a string of 4 consecutive sub 100 second laps from laps 53 to lap 56. But again, taking a more detailed look at this individual phase, we can once again see the lap time chart in the top left and the positional chart in the bottom left. But now taking a look at where we started phase number 3, it is Lewis Hamilton from Sergio Perez from Max Verstappen, the 2 Ferraris, Alex Albon, Lance Stroll, then we've got an alternating quartet of the McLarens and the Renaults, Kvyat, Bottas, Gasly, Raikkonen, Grosjean, Magnussen and Giovinazzi, who DNF'd. And then looking at where we ended the Grand Prix, a 31-second gap has emerged between Hamilton and Perez. But turning our attention to the laps chart in the top left, by this first red arrow we've got Charles Leclerc and also Lewis Hamilton setting fast lap times. So it was on occasion that Hamilton went quickly, he just wasn't always the quickest. But then again, we've also got the case of cars going very, very slowly by this top red arrow here. This is both Romain Grosjean and also Daniel Ricciardo, both having difficulties in the wet weather. We then have the period from laps 50 to 55 just here of Lando Norris being consistently the fastest car on track, as well as then setting the fastest lap time of the Grand Prix on the final lap of the Grand Prix. And that's about it from the lap chart of phase number 3. So turning our attention to the positions chart of phase number 3, we can see here the pit stop of Max Verstappen, pit stop number 2, which drops him down to P7. We then have one final positional change for Verstappen, which comes at lap number 52 as he gets past his teammate, and then also a couple of positional changes for Valtteri Bottas, who moves slowly down the field outside of the points, and then also that final change between the 2 Ferraris of Charles Leclerc and Sebastian Vettel. And there we go, there is the tale in the data of the Turkish Grand Prix of 2020. A very, very good race to watch, and one that did actually have a couple of mysterious sections in the data. The fact that Lewis Hamilton had a dominant victory over 30 seconds, yet in no phase of this Grand Prix was he ever the fastest car on track. The main bonus for Lewis Hamilton really came from the fact that he just did one less pit stop than everybody else, and managed to maintain his slick to mediate compound of tyres all the way to the checkered flag. And there is the tale in the data of the Turkish Grand Prix. Please let me know what you've thought of today's video. If there is anything you liked/disliked, please let me know in the comments down below. It helps me build as a creator and also make better content for you guys to enjoy. If you also have any other races for me to take a look at, then please let me know as well, and I will definitely take a look at doing one of those. Just bear in mind that they do take a little while to produce, as I do have to sift through a lot of race data and also tyre data as well from Pirelli, so they will take a couple of weeks to produce. But that's all I've got for you today, guys. I hope you have enjoyed, and I will catch you in the next episode with whatever and whenever I decide to make it. I'll see you guys then.